Today, we're going to talk about what your startup is worth. Maybe you're raising money, maybe there's an exit, or maybe you just want to know what the heck your startup's worth. Is it $1 billion? Is it nothing? Who knows? This is Raw Startup. I've seen the full journey from raising a tiny angel round to raising a mammoth $155 million D round for Vivino. I've raised $200 million for Vivino alone, and finding the right valuation is always a challenge. But there are ways and methods to find that valuation, and that's what I'm going to show you today. I'm going to show you 3 different methods for putting a valuation on a startup for both funding and exit. 2 of them are mostly for startups, the 3rd one is more for a mature company. I'll give you very specific methods that will enable you to set a value on your startup. I've done many rounds of raising money, and it's crucial to have some tools to set the right value. The right value being, a very high valuation. First, we look at the funding method of valuation. It can be used all the way from an angel round to a B or C round. Secondly, we have the revenue method. The revenue method can be used for a startup that has some revenue. Doesn't have to have a lot of revenue, but just some revenue. Finally, it's going to be the PE method, which is used more for mature companies. Good, let's dig into the funding method. Basically, a valuation that's based on how much funding is needed for the startup and how much equity are you willing to give investors. This is very much based on theory or even gut feeling than a specific scientific method. Some people will say it's more art than science. However, this is very much what's used for the early stages, specifically angel, seed, and A rounds. This method is strictly used for a fundraise. It cannot be used for an exit. Okay, let's dig in and see how the value is actually found. Start by asking yourself, how big an investment does the startup need to go to the next level? Usually to be able to run for 2 years or so. Let's say that's 1 million, for example. You need 1 million to get to the next level. Then the next question is, how much are you willing to give to investors for that? Usually that number is around 20%, usually not lower than 10, and preferably not higher than 30%. Now that pretty much determines how much the startup is worth. If, for example, it's 1 million for 20%, the value is 5 million. Do I need to go through the math? Okay, look at this. 1 million divided by 20%, 5 million. Obviously, the startup is looked at as a whole, but there are no real financial models made. It is a complete look at the startup, all the usual things, product, team, traction, and so on and so forth. The most important thing, though, might actually be potential. How much potential is actually in this startup? People are willing to pay a lot to get into startups where they see this one has a potential to become $1 billion company. The problem is, obviously, if the investor says, no, this is not worth 5 million, then you either have to ask for less money or give away more equity. And at that point, the value of the startup can actually change radically. Let me show you an example. Let's say you go down to 750,000 instead of 1 million. You give away 25% instead of 20%. Now the startup's actually worth 3 million instead of 5 million. Again, this is all theory. It's all about what you can build with that money. Now, where does that leave us when it comes to valuation of early stage startups? Let me show you some typical examples. At an angel round, 500,000 to 3 million. At a seed round, 3 million to 15 million. At an A round, between 20 and 75 million. At a B round, between 50 million and 250 million. These numbers change all the time. When we did a similar video a few years ago, these numbers were much smaller. I tell you, valuations are crazy high these days. For a C round or later, different methods are usually used. So when you do fundraise, you're most likely to end in one of these buckets. Then it's just a matter of how much money do you want to raise and how much are you willing to give away. Be aware that this is somewhat of a theoretical value. You probably cannot sell the company for this kind of money. It is about faith in the future, faith in what the team can do for the future. If that team falls apart, the company could be worth nothing. Next is the revenue model. Now let's take a look at the second method, the revenue model. Basically, you use the revenue to determine the value of a startup. Usually this would be a company with revenue, but not profitable. Well, the revenue is a given, so that's pretty easy. To signal this is about the future, very often the revenue used is the next 12 months. So whatever you estimate the revenue to be in the next 12 months, also known as NTM. So how do you get from revenue to valuation? Well, you need a multiplier. We use a multiplier that we multiply with the revenue to get the actual valuation. The trick is to find the multiplier. And I promise you, this multiplier can vary a lot, all the way from 1 up to over 100. I've built this graph in 2 dimensions to find the multiplier. The 2 dimensions we use for the multiplier are growth and recurrence. I will get into what recurrence means in a second. On the y-axis, we have growth. How fast does the startup grow? The higher the growth rate, the higher the multiplier. I would say the middle here is around 25% growth year over year. So if you're over 25%, you're over the line. If you're under 25%, you're under the line. On the x-axis, we have recurrence. This means that any revenue that is very likely to reoccur gives a higher multiplier. So for instance, if you have a SaaS business model, software as a service, based on subscription, you have a very high reoccurrence. It's very likely that the customers keep buying year after year. That's a high reoccurrence, which gives a high multiplier. On the other end of the x-axis, we have something like a consulting business that mostly is one-off revenue. Consulting has a low occurrence and therefore a low multiplier. Another extreme product would be a product like Legacy Box. They convert old photos into digital. And you think to yourself, how often do you really need to convert your old photos into digital? Maybe only once in your life. That's a low reoccurrence business. Okay, let's take a look at the 4 quadrants here. In the bottom left corner, you find the lowest multiplier. This is a company with low growth and little recurrence. Growth here is less than 25% a year. This is the worst quadrant, and you should expect a low 1 to 2 times multiplier. This is some sort of product that's sold one-off, like the Legacy Box I told you about earlier, that has very limited recurrence. On the top left, we have high growth and low recurrence. This could be a consulting company with a growth of over 25% a year. Multiplier in this quadrant is usually between 2 and 5 times. Now let's go to the bottom right, and this is an odd one that doesn't happen much. Low growth and high level of recurrence. Things that have a high level of recurrence usually have a decent growth, so this is rare. Multiplier probably between 1 and 10. Finally, we have the top right corner, the land of milk and honey. This, my friend, is a great place to be. We have good growth and high level of recurrence. The companies are usually valued very, very high. Let's take a typical SaaS company, a software as a service company. They can easily get a multiplier of 20 here. Take a company like Vivino, good growth, but not subscription. It turns out when people buy a bottle of wine, they drink it and then they need a new one. So pretty good recurrence. And Vivino will get a 12 to 15 multiplier here. Now you can see extreme multipliers here. Most of them are between 10 and 100. In some cases over 100. If that happens, it's because the growth is crazy and the recurrence very, very strong. So over 100, it's rare, but it does happen. Now you have the multiplier. All you have to do now is multiply the revenue with the multiplier and you have the valuation. Let's say you have a SaaS company with a 50x multiplier and 1 million in revenue. Simple. You have a $50 million valuation. Not bad. Boom, done. That's how you use the revenue method. If you have a little bit of revenue in your startup, try this method just for fun. Put whatever you get in the comments and I will reply to it. Finally, we have the third method, the PE method, also known as the price earning method. This is a method commonly used by more mature companies. It can be used both for private or public companies, but the company has to be profitable. This method cannot be used if the company isn't profitable. The method in itself is pretty simple. You take your earnings, which is your profits, and multiply it with the PE ratio. The trick here is to find the PE ratio, also known as a multiplier in this case. Normally the PE ratio is between 10 and 30, and normally software companies are around 20. The cool thing here is that you can look up any listed company and see their PE ratio for inspiration. With that, let's take a look at a few examples. Oracle, currently at 19. I think that makes sense. Apple is around 28, also makes sense. Tesla, on the other hand, is at 400. Crazy. What it means is the investors really believe in the future. They're saying it's fine that Tesla doesn't make any money right now, but we think they'll make a lot of money in the future. Amazon is over 50, also very, very high, but they're known to not be that profitable, but invest in the future. And the investors are buying into that. If you're a software company, a typical value here will be 20, and all you have to do is multiply your profit with the 20 multiplier and you have your valuation. As an example, you make 1 million in profit and have a multiplier of 20. Multiply those two and you have a value of the company of 20 million. Pretty simple. Okay, let's take a look at the full overview here. You will most likely use the funding method or maybe the revenue method for an early stage startup. Try them out and let me know what you think in the comments. For the funding method, there's usually little to no revenue and you have to use that method. When it comes to the revenue model, they're usually very, very high growth, but no profit. That's when you have to use the revenue model. Then when it comes to a more later stage, you can use the PE method, and that requires you're profitable, but doesn't require that much growth. If you want more content just like this, please consider pressing like and subscribe so you won't miss any future videos. Thank you very much for watching. Now stop watching and go build something.